Okay, today I want to do a coding example where we implement a Bootstrap carousel. Kind of see here a decent looking, good performing, and accessible for the most amount of people. Bootstrap carousel version 5.3. And so, there's a lot of decisions that can go into making a Bootstrap carousel, but here's this very simple carousel that checks all of those boxes. Again, we're going to go through what is decent looking to you and to me. This, I'm not saying this is a perfect carousel. However, it's a decent looking carousel. And so, this is a Bootstrap carousel, of course. You're going to start on getbootstrap.com, and you need to bring in Bootstrap into your projects. Depending on the kind of website that you're building, you may be familiar with how to bring in Bootstrap already. There's a lot of different ways if you go to read the docs to bring in Bootstrap. Probably one of the quickest ways is to just use the CDNs. If you notice here, we're bringing in a CDN for the CSS and a Bootstrap, and a CDN for the JavaScript. And so this is kind of the easiest way to bring in Bootstrap. Now the class that I'm teaching happens to be a ASP.NET class, and so the way that we spin up these projects is by using Visual Studio Community. So you could use Visual Studio Code and just bring in the CDN. However, this is a .NET Core class, so I'm just going to use this template, and I'll just call this Carousel Demo. And so where it goes on your computer and the template are basically the two settings that I'm configuring there. And just use those defaults. Let me back out. I don't want to overwrite that folder. I already have a Chapter 03 folder, so that'll create a new folder called Chapter 3 V2. And so this is a ASP.NET web application, and just to kind of boot it up here to show you that there's really not much going on. It's just a basic template. So let me start that, and you can see it's just a basic page. There's a Bootstrap nav bar. So it does kind of, this template automatically links into Bootstrap. If I inspect this, just to kind of show you, it is Bootstrap. You can see Bootstrap min CSS. If I click on that link, let's follow that URL just to show you the Bootstrap version. Inherently, this is version 5.1. If I look here, Bootstrap is on version 5.3. So the template that I'm using is a couple of minor versions behind. I like to update that. So the way to do that here, again, I'm just going to update 5.1 to 5.3, is on my solution, I can add, on the project, I need to right-click the project and add a client-side library. I'm going to search for Bootstrap, and I have a target location, so this is going to download the updated CSS and the updated JavaScript. The problem here is that it needs to go into a dist folder. Otherwise, this is going to replace the files that are already in my project. If you don't put it in that dist folder, it just has 2 copies of Bootstrap, and I don't need the old copy. I need to replace. So I'm going to click on Install, and if I look at my output, you could see that happened pretty quickly. If I go into wroot now, and I go into lib bootstrap dist CSS, I can kind of see here now I'm on Bootstrap version 5.3. Okay, so I'm just getting that up and running to the latest version. Of course, the major version is version 5. The minor version is version 3. And then the bug fix is that third, the .3. Those are bug fixes and feature enhancements in that third version number there. Nonetheless, now we want to look at the HTML. We don't need to look at anything, any controllers or any models. Really, we're just going to stay focused on the HTML. And the home page is right here, this index home page. And the starting point for us will be to look at a carousel. So a carousel on the left-hand side here of getbootstrap.com right here. And I'm trying to summarize what I've kind of found in my experience in the Bootstrap docs. But here's a basic example of a simple slide. Now, as you add to this, you definitely can add indicators, and you can definitely add captions. And so those are easy additions. But I'm going to start off with the most basic example right here, and I'm going to start, and then we're going to inspect this real quick. So let me plop this in, and real quick, we've got an outer div with the name of our carousel called carousel example. That's our ID of our carousel. Then inside of that, we've got an inner div with our images. So we kind of got some nested divs here. Ultimately, these are our images that we will work with right here. And then we've got those buttons on the left and the button on the right to kind of manually control the sliding. But these images are not there by default. And so if I kind of take a look at this, we're going to get the alt text of some dots here because these images aren't showing up because, well, we have to download those images. That takes me on to this whole discussion around what's good images for a carousel. So, the thing to look at here when you're downloading images, and I'll jump ahead, is that you want images with consistent dimensions. And so, the first thing is, well, what images, what dimensions, again, how wide the images are and how tall the images are, what images are good in carousels? And there's kind of two what are called aspect ratios, 16 pixels by 9, so 16 wide by 9. And these are some actual dimensions that fall into that, 1920 by 1080. Again, 1920 wide by 1080 tall, 1280 wide by 720 pixels tall, or more of a square aspect ratio. This is more of the Instagram type post, where it's a little bit taller, and 4 by 3 and not as wide. So 1600 by 12. So depending on the kind of image, these are just general ratios of images that work well. Then it's like, well, where do you get your images? On the internet, there's two very popular places to download images. Pexels is my go-to in most cases, but there's also Unsplash. And so you could choose either one of these. And for this demonstration, I'm just going to search for programmers. Okay, so here's some images, and what's nice about Pexels is as my recommendation here, I'll just use the 1280 by 720. These are very common, to find. So if I click on this free download, there's 1280 by 848, and we could choose that again, just 1280 by 720. Let's go to the next image. Free download. So some of them you're going to notice they fall right on the dimensions, and some of them don't. So if I kind of look at this one, 1920 by 1280. So it seems like the 1920 is a little more common. If I go back here, 1282. Again, they are off a little bit, and we can account for that, right? 1920 by 1280. So they're all pretty close, the way that we can download them. A lot of times they're pretty close, but not directly on. And that can actually cause some problems with the carousel if they're not the exact same size. But you wind up resizing them anyways. And so, if you don't write custom CSS, it's kind of best to use exactly the same. But we're going to resize these with our CSS. So as long as they're close to that 1920 by 1280, or as I have here, 1280 by 720, as long as they're close, That'll get the job done. So let me go ahead and I'll pick 3 images, 1920 by 1080. So let's just pick 3. So I'll just go ahead and click on that guy, download, and putting it in the right folder, of course. I made this chapter 3 v2. Now where I'm gonna put this, in my case, my images go in www root. So all static files, CSS, JavaScript, images, static files go in www root. And I'm gonna make a new folder here called images. And I'm gonna plop my image downloads inside there. And to kind of show you on my computer, if I were to go back into this chapter 3 v2 carousel www root images, now there's my image, and when you click it, thankfully it's 1920 by 1280. You can see the dimensions right there. If not, go to properties and you'll see the dimensions there, but 1920 by 1280. So let's download this one. 1920 by close enough. We'll download it, call it 2. Of course, you want to give these descriptive names. 1, 2, and 3 is not a best practice for your image names. But for the sake of just getting this into a working example, I'll call my images 1, 2, 3. Now, of course, we need to replace this with images /1 images 2 and images 3. So, kind of back to the notes here is a decent looking, the objective is a decent looking carousel. Well, to make it decent looking, you want to start with images that are consistent, that have the same aspect ratios, or very similar aspect ratios. And then, of course, you want to optimize. And so when I download these images, their file size, in many cases, are bigger than they need to be. 178K. This is a discussion around, well, if it's a smaller file size, of course, it'll download faster, but then you might, you have to balance it. You don't want it to be too small and you start getting pixelated images. And so there are free softwares out there to help you maintain that ratio of good quality image with a smaller file size. And so Tiny PNG, JPEG Optimizer, these are free software downloads that you can download, and you can optimize your images for the internet, for the web, for fast downloads without destroying the images and making them very pixelated. So again, that's a performance thing. So you want consistent images on their dimensions, you want to optimize them, and then at the end of the day, we're going to write some CSS to adjust our images at the various screen sizes. And so we may need media queries. If a big image just isn't going to look good on a mobile device, you may need to swap out that image using some CSS at different breakpoints at different screen sizes. Okay, so those are some basics there. Let's take a look at the code and see what this is looking like right now as we boot this up. And okay, so here you can kind of see we've got our carousel, and just a little bit, if you're watching closely, you can kind of see the defaults that it's going to take. These are big images, like again 1920 by 10. These are very large images, and so probably the first thing that people who are coding the carousel, they go, well, this is too big. I don't want this to actually take up my whole screen. And that's something that I've seen a lot. It's like, hey, well, I'm just pulling from the Bootstrap docs, and the height of these images, it's taking up way too much space. And so very quickly you find out you need to write a little bit of custom CSS to not let it take up all that much space. Like you notice I've actually shrunk this down to take up less space. Another thing is that our images are actually different sizes, and if you pay real close attention, you can see my carousel kind of jumping a little bit because the images are actually different sizes. And so you wanna fix that with custom CSS. And that's going to be what we do next. And so here I have a CSS file that's already linked up, and the CSS that we're going to target is the class of carousel inner and the images that are inside of the carousel inner. Okay, so just to inspect here, here's my div of carousel hyphen inner. Okay, so this is the class of carousel inner, and then these images inside of that div. Now, it is worth noticing a couple of Bootstrap classes of dblock and w100, and these styles are being applied, the w100, to our images. And so that w100, you can kind of see what that class does. If you get rid of that w100, it's not filling, or it's not the background isn't filling properly. We want to see the full image, and so we're kind of getting that behavior of it's bringing the image size down because our height is the size of this container, and so it's modifying its width automatically. So that's something that's interesting. If you want to take that off, dblock also is display block. Images are not block level elements by default. So if I take that off, notice kind of the behavior. I like that W100. So I'm not going to take that off. With 100, bring that back. Okay. Now with this custom CSS, there's two things that I want to look at. A maximum height. I'm going to use the viewport height. It's a relative value. So max height of 60 viewport height, or 50 or 80, whatever it may be. And then I'm going to look at the object fit CSS property. So let's start with max height. And I'm going to make this relative. Of course, you could do static measurements, but I'm going to say like 60 viewport height. So that's a relative measurement. And I want to do object fit, and I'm going to say contain. Now, object fit is a CSS property that controls a replaced element, such as an image, to be resized to fit its container. So an image inside of its container. How does an image get resized inside of its container is how you can think of it. And there's different values here. Fill, contain. So fill, you can kind of see, stretches it out. Contain leaves some extra space on the sides. Cover is more of a stretching. None, and scale down. So these are the different values, and we can mess with it. So here's 60% viewport height and object fit contain. So if I 60% of the device's viewport, you just say the device's height. And this, you can see my code helper wanted to suggest something here. Contain the image dimensions. It'll basically maintain the dimensions inside, so it doesn't have to stretch or pull. The dimensions will be contained within inside of the parent. And so, pull that up. And there we go. And so what we have here, now we kind of lost our indicators, but what this is doing is maintaining that aspect ratio that looks pretty good. You know, the height and width, or you're not stretching either direction, but you obviously lost the indicators, and so most users aren't going to know that, you know, we got white on white here, right? So what you can consider doing, you know, obviously changing the background color of the carousel. And so if I target the class of carousel, and, you know, whatever color you want to set, but here's just a gray color so that you can kind of see the contrasting white against the gray, and you can, again, you can see the indicators. So what I like about this, why I think this is a decent looking carousel, is you're not stretching the images. Okay, with using a relative height, you can decide how tall you want it to be. Of course, you're gonna have to fit your overall layout, right? So you might have a flex box or a grid system, and you know how these heights and these widths all need to play nicely in those systems. But here, again, keeping it basic, we just have, you know, a carousel without any other containers. And again, I like the aspect ratio is it's smaller, but it's maintained. Okay, so that's how I liked, you know, in experimenting with the sizing of my images. There are many other solutions. This is just one of them. But at the end of the day, regardless of what CSS you write, you're probably going to want to write some custom CSS. Or use some Bootstrap classes and maybe grid systems. I've done that in the past as well, you know, using Flexbox or the grid. Okay, now another note on the carousel performance, and this was from the docs. Basically, considering the page load time, you do want to write a little bit of custom script, and so this carousels must be manually initialized. And so there's a little bit of script here. I just want to show how to bring this script in. Obviously, this is JavaScript. This JavaScript is using vanilla JavaScript to select a carousel, and then basically this is a constructor that initializes your carousel. Again, this is going to help with the performance of your carousel and basically speed up your page load time. You're being explicit in what needs to happen with that carousel. Now, if you don't do this, your carousel will still work, as mine does. However, it's just it will likely load slower, again, according to the Bootstrap docs. So I just want to show how to bring this in. It's pretty simple. Now, I want to kind of go to my outer layout. So when I'm looking at this index file, this is just the content of that page. But I have an outer layout file, which you'll notice here, I am linking to jQuery, I'm linking to Bootstrap, and I'm linking to some custom JavaScript. But this is my Bootstrap JavaScript. This needs to load first. And so, you know, what you want to make sure to do is get line 45 to load before you bring in this script. Obviously, the order of calling your scripts matter. And so, you know, what I can do here, there's a couple ways to do it here, and I'm going to get into line We'll talk about this later in the class, but you know, the most primitive way to do this is I'm just going to hard code a script section, and I'm going to paste this right in. Okay, now notice that this is targeting an ID of my carousel. Well, what's the idea of carousel? It's not my carousel, it's carousel example, right? So this ID of my carousel needs to match the ID here, okay? And that's, again, the most primitive way of bringing in the carousel. Oh, by the way, don't forget to close your curly. And let me double check my, yeah, there is a parenthesis needed as well. Okay, I didn't bring these scripts in the right way, but how you know this is working is if you don't have any console errors. And so when I boot this up, okay, again, whether you notice the performance difference, of course, you can go to network and slow it down, and you know, throttle this to a real slow. But needless to say, if I go to inspect and I look at my console and I don't have any error messages here, that constructor is being called. Again, performance benefit. We said we're going to make a performant carousel, and this is per the Bootstrap docs, something that you want to do. Okay, so here we go. Decent looking, got that. Good performing. We've talked about a couple of ways to get your images to perform well and the carousel to perform well. And the last thing is a discussion around accessibility. And so one thing when it comes to your carousels is you might want them to autoplay. Well, they make it pretty easy by adding this attribute. Let me show you. On the carousel itself, if I add this HTML attribute, data bootstrap ride equals carousel. I'm gonna go ahead and save that and refresh my page, and there it goes. Notice it is auto playing, auto scrolling in. You know, my gut tells me, well, yeah, I've got an image carousel. I want it to scroll automatically. However, when you stop and think about accessibility, okay, and that's people with disabilities, and there's many kinds of disabilities, why this is considered a bad thing. And again, this is kind of in the docs. You can read about auto playing carousels, and it says right here, for accessibility reasons, we recommend avoiding auto playing carousels. And why is that? Well, autoplay is considered bad for accessibility. So let's start here. The constant movement can be distracting and make it difficult for users to focus on the main content of the page. Again, so users with cognitive disabilities, you know, they just need the information. They don't need a lot of moving parts. Animations are generally considered not a good thing for accessibility. So moving parts on the page is what I mean by animations. Users may not be able to read the content on the carousel at their own pace. And so, you know, how often are those slides scrolling? Every 2 seconds, every 4 seconds? That might be too fast for some people, and that might be frustrating. And for screen readers, of course, devices, software reading the screens for blind or hard of seeing users, auto-playing carousels can be disruptive. In other words, you know, the screen reader might start reading a slide, and then that slide changes, so it has to change what it's reading. And so in general, you know, you can make auto-playing carousels, but they're not considered good for accessibility. So that is a decision that is up to you and the developers of the website and the decision makers of the websites that you're building. But that's how you autoplay, and that's why you might actually decide not to autoplay and just give them some indicators and let them manually control the slides. And you will notice here we kind of fixed our issue by saying 60 viewport height all our images are consistent size. All right, and so again, is this the most advanced tutorial of Bootstrap Carousel? No, but these are the foundations. These are the fundamentals. This is where I would want to start. The idea of building a Bootstrap Carousel and then add to it from here, and the things that you can add. You know, the theming, the colors, the dark theme. You know, disable the swiping. Another thing, you know, here, this is actually disabling on mobile view a swipe feature. You can consider disabling swiping on mobile, or make it enabled. And so there's a lot deeper that you can go, but I wanted to start with the basics. And hope you enjoyed.